My name is Lee, a transgender activist. I'm Robert Hamblin.
My name is Ecclesia De Lange. I work for Inclusive and Affirming Ministries.
My name is Reverend Solakishilem.
Hi, my name is Tiara and I'm from Zimbabwe.
My name is Dylan Kalembo.
My name is Evans L. Atufo.
My name is Daniel Da Silva.
Gilan Koko.
LGBTI was there. It has been there since the olden days. But it's just that back then it was hidden. It was underground so that people if I speak about Xhosa, in Xhosa there were people who were called Amatalase. Those people were born even back in the days, but they were put in somewhere in isolation. And you had people who slept same-sex, people who sleep together. And those people were believed that they are in some calling, like ancestors. If you are a traditional healer back then that gives you a right to sleep with the same sex. Because they believe that if you're a woman sleeping with another woman, so you have more power, or a man sleeping with another man, that means you have more power now as traditional healer. But if we go to tradition and culture, LGBTI has been there. It differs from country to country, from language to language, from tradition to tradition, but it has always been there. We grow up, it has always been there. It's just that now the terminology, we're using the LGBTI, but if you go back to the rural areas, they're using Italase, and in other languages also, there's that. How do we normalize what is abnormal according to tradition and culture? Which is to them what is not normal is the LGBTI. History at schools, talk about these things, talk about what used to happen, talk about these traditional healers who slept, talk about what happened in the mines back then, talk about the Amatalase that happened, but you don't find those things in our history because it's not in curriculum. And finding ways and also bringing in arts and culture, because if you go into the communities, that means that's dialogue. Just have a normal dialogue with an elderly person and ask about what was going on. Develop a stage play, call the whole community, showcase, film festival, showcase, and also the language that is used. English doesn't work for people who speak Xhosa in the villages, for people who speak Zulu in the villages also. The language, when you're going back to the villages, what language do we use? And also back to the terminology, what other terms that are we using? Because if I go to my mom and say, Mama, I'm a lesbian, then she will say, out of my house. But if I say, you know what, Mama, Talase, use that language. And she will say, oh, you know, back then there was a woman who was like, oh, and you.
Religious leaders hold extreme power within communities. Forging a relationship with religious leaders, dialoguing with them, contextual Bible studies, and finding means that we can collaborate on intersections, finding intersections like equality, family values, and so forth.
We've noticed that there is a knowledge gap between the clergies, congregants, as well as the community. So which created that division within the church, because some pastors, they even just preach scriptures out of context. So we really need to preach that to ensure that pastors, they are getting continuously theological trainings and theological reflections, so that they can able to articulate these issues within the church in an informed, and there is a great need of a spiritually reconciliation on spiritually as well as on a sexual life being, because some people, they are living on a spiritual, they're just living their life in a spiritual perspective, neglecting the sexual that point of view or point of life being, which means that they are only focusing on one factor of life, because church normally deals with different factors like spiritual, social, and other factors. So we better balance those factors.
What I heard was
included stuff around legal access. So in other words, people had discussions about what does an identity document mean and the privileges that come with it. So if you don't present as cisgender heteronormative, then you have trouble accessing services.
How accessing health services, if you had an identity, would be so much better, where they would recognize your problem easier.
A lot of people said, oh wow, okay, we met a lot of people from different regions and they have different information, and we spoke about meeting different communities. What I also like to feed into the discussion is that by meeting other communities in Africa or in different parts of South Africa even, you realize that we don't have to follow the Western model when it comes to queerness or being transgender and that. So there was a lot of agreements about that because there's different ways of being transgender all over. As transgenders, how do we start a movement? And the answers to that was?
By looking at things that they do and what they do, such as best practices.
That's right. There's stuff about best practices that we can look at, but also documenting of what we're doing. Academic documenting, writing, learning to write, and storytelling that gets published, because that's powerful.
We need to have a more jointed civil society taking up action to become reference points, especially for the various religious communities that have never really had interaction before with members of the LGBTI community. There are also other regional coalitions that are working on issues of integrating spirituality and sexuality with a broader context, being that sexuality is not a standalone as much as religion is not a standalone. It has broad cross-cutting issues that need to be unpacked and brought to the basic levels for a lot of the change that we would like to see happening in the region. And the way forward around that is that we need to now start a process of dialogues and a process of giving information at its simplest form to every religious leader out there, and it shouldn't necessarily be from one religious concept. It should be an interfaith-led approach.
Because there's this heteronormative assumption of then our parents then just assuming that us, their children, we are also going to be then grow up into that heteronormative setup. However, now we've crossed, for some of us, we've crossed those gender binaries now to then say, while I was brought up as a male, I was born as a male, I have crossed that gender now. I now present myself as female. I now identify myself as female. So now there's now the need to then negotiate, to then say, how do I get my parents to then understand me as that person who has crossed those heterosexual gender lines, and also how do I also bring myself to a level I also then become comfortable to also be very conversant with my family, to also then make them understand how do I want to be represented as, or how do I want to be addressed as a he, as a she, as a it, as a they, however I feel like I need to be. At least we really need to start questioning the norm. That's our way forward. After we have questioned the norm, why do we do these things? Why do we even need, is there any need to then conform to certain labels and binaries and boxes? And after we have questioned that, we need to own the difference to then say, I might want to identify as an it. That shouldn't be even up for discussion.
Apart from South Africa, many countries in Southern Africa don't have them. South Africa has a lot to offer when it comes to experience, especially regarding research and the tools that are used to engage in discussions around bullying in schools. That because there is lack of funding to implement research in education, one of the recommendations was that we need to have a panel of donors, researchers and activists to start this discussion. We need to have safe spaces to engage in discussions among unions, school government bodies, activists, Minister of Education, to talk about the bullying around sexual orientation and gender identity.
My name is Gilan Koko, and I'm a project program officer for LGBTI refugees are Church World Service. The key barrier that we try to identify, the first one was access to legal documentation, which is the refugee status for refugees and asylum seekers permit. Number two, it was the policy, harsh policy that Home Affairs officials are taking with regard to refugee rights. As a result, so many LGBTI refugees applications for refugee status been denied. It was also the problem of xenophobia, which also affects the LGBTI refugees community to better integrate into South African community. So these are the minority within a minority to find a space whereby we can link up with other LGBTI organizations so that they can better provide service for LGBTI. They can create a safe space. Not only LGBTI refugees organization, but also faith leaders also, they should create also a space for LGBTI refugees. If organizations come together, both refugees organization and LGBT organization, we can create a space for how we can link up with Home Affairs officials to see how we can provide them a training so that they can be well equipped with knowledge on SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity, and also asylum seeker process, so then to know how they can do a proper interview application process for LGBTI refugees.
My name is Evans L. Atofo. I'm from Liberia. Some of the safety and security issue has to do with verbal attacks. Some effects of that have to do with suicide. We look at bullying in schools. We look at individual security, looking at it from the physical attack, living public spaces. Most of the time, religion point homosexuality to look at it as being un-African, it's deeply rooted in the culture, but if we must change some of those things, we must have a cultural revolution, that is, go down and entrench into our own culture and tradition, see where can we pick up some of those issues, even if it is not LGBT specific, but look at it in general, look at equality, looking at participation in families, in our community. And then one of the major things that stood out was the issue about activists, looking at care and concern for our own self, because we work ourselves 24/7, 365 days of the year. We're making sure that things are happening, making sure our community are safe, we're ensuring that people are safe, people's rights are not violated, and all of that. The question is, who cares and concern about us?